Welcome to St. Mary's on the 18th Sunday after Pentecost. You know, when I was a child growing up in the church, we heard about the 10 Commandments a great deal. And this morning, our first lesson is from the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, where Moses has just received the 2 tablets of stone that God has given them with his commandments for his people. And I was reminded that it's been a while since we looked at them. I think most of us remember them pretty well. In case we don't, let me review them for us quickly. And I'll use the version that's from Rite 1 in the Book of Common Prayer, which is the one that I think a lot of us grew up with. Thou shalt not make to thyself any graven image. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember that thou shalt keep the Sabbath day holy. Honor thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt do no murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet. Many of us who remember hearing those on Sunday mornings during the great Decalogue may have been inclined to say, "Incline our hearts to keep this law," the usual and customary response. And yet, often our hearts are hardened against God's law, hardened even against God's love. Americans, Westerners in general, Americans in particular, are very independent people. We like to do things our own way. We don't want to be told what to do or how to do it. We think the commandments are fine for other people, but they don't apply with the same force to us. But they do. And there's the rub. The 10 Commandments that we know so well from the book of Exodus were given to God's people when they were in the midst of their exile, in the midst of their great crossing of the wilderness for 40 years. God needed to impose some order, some discipline on this unruly, stiff-necked people, as he called them, who were all too willing to do things their own way. And so God said, there's got to be some rules. We have to have some guidelines, some commandments, some laws, and some laws that we can each learn and can keep. And the 10 Commandments are interesting because instead of being all about God, they're all mostly about us. If you were listening carefully, the first 3 commandments have to do with our relationship to God. The remaining 7 have to do with our relationships with one another. That says something about human nature too, doesn't it? That God felt we needed more rules about how we get along and relate to one another than how we get along and relate to God. That's important. That's worth thinking about. Whenever I come to reflect on the Old Testament, the Decalogue in the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Bible in particular, I like to turn to the great scholar and theologian Walter Brueggemann. Brueggemann is perhaps one of the greatest scholars of the Old Testament in the 20th century, and his writings and reflections on those books and how they apply in our modern era to me are very helpful. And I want to share with you some of Brueggemann's thoughts and some of my own, and they'll be kind of mixed together, but it's worth listening to. Brueggemann tells us that the commands are commonly understood as divided into 2 tablets, one concerning relations to God and one concerning the neighbor. In fact, they're often depicted that way. You see Moses holding 2 big tablets with commandments 1, 2, and 3 on one side and 4 through 10 on the other. 2 tablets, one for the laws with relationship to God, the other our relationships to one another, to our neighbor. The relation between the 2 tablets is of crucial importance to biblical faith. It is self-evident that the second tablet is the more readily available, practical, and pertinent to us. It is risky, however, to take the second tablet by itself as positive law concerning human relations. But such a view misses the primary covenant point that these neighbor demands have their warrant, their impetus, and their urgency in the character of this particular God. The second tablet is not just a set of good ideas, It contains conditions of viable human life, non-negotiable conditions rooted in God's own life and God's ordering of the world. Thus, it is important to get it right about Yahweh in order to get it right about our neighbor. Karl Marx, yes, that Karl Marx, has seen this most clearly and pragmatically. Marx wrote, "The criticism of heaven is thus transformed into the criticism of the earth, the criticism of religion into the criticism of the law, and the criticism of theology into the criticism of politics." Marx means that God talk always implicitly asserts neighbor relations, and that every mode of neighbor relations inevitably bootlegs some powerful and even hidden notion of God. Thus, it is not the case simply that Israel must attend both to God and to their neighbor, but that the way of attending to God determines our way of attending to our neighbor, and vice versa. It is precisely the worship of the God of the Exodus that provides the elemental insistence and passionate imagination to reshape human relations in healing, liberating ways. The Decalogue stands as a critical principle of protest against every kind of exploitation, social relation, public and personal, capitalist and socialist, and as a social vision of possibility that every social relation can be transformed and made a liberating relation. Powerful stuff. God didn't give us these commandments just to keep the unruly children of Israel in line on a long trip. This is not Dad pounding on the dashboard of the van saying, "If you guys don't knock it off, I'm going to just pull over and park." That's not what the commandments are about. God is giving us a set of guidelines, a set of values, a set of deep-seated principles, so that we know more about how He loves and cares for us, and how He wants us to love and care for each other. Let me give you some more from Walter Brueggemann. He says, "The truth of the matter is that the biblical God is not very user-friendly. The theological crisis present in our modern situations of proclamation and interpretation is that we are all children of Feuerbach." More about him in a minute. In the 19th century, Ludwig Feuerbach fully articulated the hidden assumption of the Enlightenment. You know how I am about the Enlightenment. That God is, in the end, a projection of our best humanness. That Feuerbachian betrayal takes more than one form. The liberal temptation is to dismiss and diminish the role of God, either to remove God entirely from the public spheres of life and leave God only to our interpersonal matters, or to make God an object of adoration rather than a subject who can do anything. For example, one signal of such reductionism is the slogan that God has no hands but our own. Does that mean that God can't act at all? That only we can act on behalf of God? That diminishes God. The reactive conservative temptation is the projection of a settled sovereign God who in fact is not operative as a political character, but only a set of fixed propositions that give certitude and stability. We get that in let go and let God, that somehow nothing we can do will change anything, that we've left it all in God's hands. We have no responsibility. Well, those are both fallacious arguments. On the one hand, God hasn't left everything up to us, expecting us to do everything without Him being involved at all. But it's also not that God is going to do everything and we don't have to do anything. The answer lies somewhere in the middle. That dynamic relationship between ourselves and our Creator extends to our relationships with one another, and our relationships with one another reflect the dynamic relationship of ourselves with God. It sounds a little confusing, but I think it makes some sense. That we reflect what we know. We reflect what we have been taught. We try to accomplish what God is trying to accomplish with God, in harmony with God's will, not as opposed to God's will, doing it all on our own, nor do we get to just abrogate our responsibility entirely and say, well, it's all in God's hands. There's nothing that I can do about it. I want to read you something else with a little more development on that second tablet, those commandments 4 through 10 about our interpersonal relationships. The second tablet is really a magisterial assertion that human life is situated in a community of rights and responsibilities that is willed by God. Within that community, human life in all its ambiguity and inscrutability is endlessly precious and must not be violated. This affirmation seems so obvious that we're reluctant to voice it. It is now clear that the obduracy of totalitarian society and the greediness of the market economy, that a humane life of shared rights and responsibilities is very fragile. The interpretive task is to show that this fragile bonding and covenant that guarantees dignity and well-being is a live possibility among us. The second tablet is indeed an articulation of a more excellent way. It is a way in which human life is intrinsically worthy of respect, in which human persons are honored ends rather than abused means, in which this rapacious desire is properly curbed for the sake of a viable community. It's heavy stuff. But I think what Brueggemann is leading us toward, and I think what God is inviting us into, is a deeper understanding of the doctrine of the human being. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? What joy, what felicity, what happiness do we share because we are made in God's image? What responsibility, what obligation, what duty do we owe because we are created in God's image? That's the crux of the Ten Commandments, the crux of the Decalogue, the crux of those 3 commandments that help define and shape our relationship with God, to remember that God is one, holy, and blessed, and to remember that we, in God's image, are also therefore holy and blessed, that we are beloved children of the Almighty, and we should behave and act like it. We have no right to abuse and excoriate one another. We have no right to exploit one human being for the benefit of another. We have no right to diminish the life of one human person because they are different from us, perhaps a different faith, perhaps different understandings, different language, different culture, different shade of pink or brown or red, a different way of looking at the world. We cannot exploit, we cannot take advantage, because God does not will it so. We are in a partnership with God to bring to fulfillment and fruition the vision that God has for his children, to live in harmony with one another and with him, that we lift one another up and help each other to move forward. This is the journey of the children of Israel across Sinai Desert. This is the wandering in the wilderness, that we work together, following God's lead and helping one another on this journey of life, on this journey toward fulfillment of God's will and God's purpose and God's plan. God has not left it to us alone to see this through, nor can we leave it alone to God. It is us who are called into relationship with God and one another to help bring in the kingdom of God, to bring in the realm of God, to bring in the reign of God, to make alive in us the will of God, the way of peace, the way of love, the way of unity, the way of harmony. The Ten Commandments are just the mileposts and guideposts along the way. They point us toward a closer relationship with God and a deeper interpersonal relationship with one another. The journey is a long and arduous one. We are on it together under God's protective leadership. Let us work together to bring in God's will, to live in harmony, unity, peace, and to not exploit and not demean and not belittle one another. Let us be beloved siblings, children of a loving God. That is the way that God would lead us. That is the way we must journey. Let us walk together in unity, harmony, and peace.